Senator Price, good morning to you.
Good morning, Ray.
Well, when we organised a chat, we weren't thinking we'd be talking about what Marcia Langton said in Western Australia recently, did we?
No, we didn't, but it's actually not surprising on the same token.
I'm just some of the things I've played this morning that seemed that the Yes campaigners don't want to take ownership of. Noel Pearson, for instance, have a listen.
And once we have a representative body, we will seek to negotiate a treaty with the Australian Parliament.
And then Marcia Langton herself.
Constitutional recognition would entrench treaties if we get the framing of it right.
Now, I think you and I are on the same page. I've spoken to your colleague Warren Mundine about this previously, that I want to see Indigenous people recognised in the Constitution. I ideally want that to happen. But it's not going to happen the way things are shaping up at the moment, with the Prime Minister not telling the population what the next chapter is. Maybe he doesn't know, Senator, what the next chapter is.
Yeah, look, and that's exactly right. I mean, basically the Prime Minister has hitched this unknown voice entity to recognition. He failed to consult the Australian people to ensure that everyone was on the same page by holding a constitutional convention to work out the detail with the Australian people in order to secure a majority. But he's spent $350 million of taxpayers' money on a gamble, basically, going ahead with this referendum with the way that it is. And, you know, the proponents, the supporters of the Yes campaign, they can't keep attempting to gaslight the Australian people. We've heard in their own words what it is they're proposing once we move beyond a successful yes vote, and the Australian people aren't agreeing with it.
At the moment, it does appear, the polls are saying, the bookmakers are saying the no vote wins, but there's a long way to go. There's another month of campaigning to come. My fear is this, and I've expressed this to Peter Dutton and to Warren Mundine: no matter who wins, we divide the nation. If yes wins, we divide the nation. If no wins, we divide the nation. And I'm fearful for what happens next, either if yes gets up or no gets up. I'm fearful.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right, because, as I've pointed out, this is probably the most divisive referendum we've ever experienced in our nation's history. You know, the issue of race has never been so prominent in our daily discourse than it is at the moment because of this. I mean, I'm receiving emails. I got one just today from a concerned grandmother whose daughter is married to an Aboriginal person and whose grandchild is Indigenous. Their son-in-law, who is Indigenous, is voting no, but their granddaughter is basically at school now experiencing, words around race and racism, and there's an intensity taking place that no children in school should have to be confronted with. But they said none of that discourse was there prior to the referendum. So there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done, regardless of what the result is at the end of this referendum.
So we've got people referred to as elites who live on the eastern seaboard, and then we've got the people you represent in the Northern Territory. And one of the things we talk about all the time, and you're at the forefront of this, is women, of course, being ill-treated, children in some cases being sexually assaulted and not going to school and not being fed properly. You've got a whole range of issues there. And I just wonder, given the billions and billions and billions of dollars that have been spent already, whether another organisation on top of the NIAA and the Coalition of Peaks, which already cost a lot of money, another organisation, whether they'll solve the problems of those people in remote communities in Queensland, New South Wales, the Northern Territory and other parts of Australia.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, for those that are suggesting that The Voice is a brand new, amazing new entity, it's absolutely detailless. We don't know what it is, but we keep being told it's an advisory. It's a $350 million advisory committee as far as the Prime Minister's concerned. That's not even set up yet. And we're being asked to constitutionally enshrine it without any at any demonstration of how it's supposed to improve the lives of the most marginalised. And then you've got like the head organisation, SNAKE, which is the national advocacy body for Indigenous children, that downplays rates of sexual abuse of Indigenous children in the Northern Territory, who comes out to basically call out myself and Peter Dutton when we want a royal commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous children, to suggest that we are only playing politics. When the advocacy body is doing that and not standing up for our kids, there is absolutely no guarantee that an unknown entity, to be constitutionally enshrined, has the best interests at heart in terms of tackling these very problems. And that is the concern of many, whether it's from Moree or Dubbo or in the Northern Territory. Aboriginal people are saying, we don't trust this process.
So let's go to not the Coalition Peaks, but the NIAA. Budget $4 billion. And we've done some investigation, somewhere between 1,300 and 1,400 people employed. 750 plus are based in Canberra. Now, I don't know that Indigenous problems are rampant in Canberra. So how can people be based in Canberra for the NIAA improving the lot of people far removed from Canberra? And will the Voice do exactly the same thing? Will it be people based in Canberra? And the Prime Minister said it's not going to cost anything. Well, you've got to have an office, you've got to have legal advice, you've got to have people that are there, I guess, media advisors as well as all the other advisors that will be there. And it seems to be another layer. One of the questions I asked very early in the debate, I said, well, if we get the Voice up, and at that time the Voice was in control according to the polls, it's no longer the Yes vote being in control, but I said, I sought an explanation from Mr Dutton, our weekly chats. I said, can you give me a tip as to what's going to happen with the NIAA Coalition of Peaks? Because they'll become superfluous, surely. And so he checked, he came back and said, no, the government intends to keep them exactly where they are, the NIAA and the Coalition of Peaks, plus all the other bodies and agencies that are there to represent Indigenous people, plus the 11 people in Parliament like yourself representing Indigenous people. So, I mean, what would the Voice do that the NIAA can't do?
Yeah, that's a $350 million question, I guess. And that's, on the same token, they want to acknowledge that the system doesn't work. So they're suggesting that those bureaucracies aren't working, and yet when Senator Karen Little, my colleague, have put two motions on the floor to launch inquiries into land council, statutory authorities, Aboriginal organisations that are funded, federally funded, to create outcomes that improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. And clearly there's acknowledgement that it's not working, that we want to understand how that money is being spent. We want to apply real accountability. We want to fix the current system that exists, as opposed to adding an additional layer to that mess. We want to fix it, and that's what we haven't done, and that's what we should be doing. But that's the hard work. It's far more easier for these people who have had a seat at the table to suggest a transfer of power to them so they can remain in power in perpetuity. That's what this is all about. This isn't about, what I'd like to see is Aboriginal people whose first language is not English hold a CEO position. But you're not going to see that, because who wants to relinquish that level of power? But that's what we should be aiming for. That would be closing the gap, ultimately.
What's your gut feeling? The polls say 4 weeks out, it's no by a big margin. The bookmakers say $1.11 no and over $5 yes. What do you think?
I think we could never be complacent when it comes to an amendment to our Constitution. I certainly will not be slowing down in terms of the campaign. They can throw all the names they want at us on our side, but we keep highlighting the fact that this $350 million voice is empty. There is nothing to it at this stage. It's supposed to be the details are filled in after the fact, and that's not good enough. That's not good enough for the Australian people. The Australian people deserve more. Our most marginalised Indigenous Australians deserve more than that. So I would say I would urge people to make sure you vote. If you want to maintain equality in our country, vote and look into the detail. You won't find any. So if you don't know, vote no. That's where that comes from. Vote no, because this is dividing our nation, and we need to get back to common sense, practical ways of addressing our issues.
One final thing. Last week I dealt with the Uruk Commission's recommendations out of Victoria. And for people who didn't catch up with it, it simply means that they'll have parallel judicial systems for non-Aboriginal and Indigenous children. In other words, they'll be dealt with differently. You issued a statement, I think, last week after it was reported about Uruk. You had grave concerns about it, and I think you typified that if you think this is okay, that's what the Voice is going to replicate. You still hold those concerns?
Absolutely, I have those concerns. They call themselves they had a truth-telling commission, if you like, which basically just went out and collected grievances. That's all it did, and then it suggested, it's true, yes, for Indigenous Victorian children, they have the highest rates of removal, but they don't address the reasons behind that removal. And we know that Indigenous children in Victoria have the highest rates, experience the highest rates of abuse, of sexual abuse. That's why there are notifications brought about because of these children, and substantiated claims 91 times out of 1,000 in terms of Indigenous kids compared to 11 out of 1,000 for non-Indigenous kids in Victoria. Those statistics are never mentioned. It's all blame on colonisation and racism. That's not a starting point to begin to fix some of those problems, but that is a point for certainly the grievances and those of the grievance industry to start making their demands and trying to set up a separate law system for those who have Aboriginal heritage. That's not what we do in Australia. We're all Australian citizens.
So I come back to where I started about division. Can you imagine the outcry that if you've got two offenders, juvenile offenders, one Indigenous, one non-Indigenous, doing the same thing? You know, they stole the car and they've some carnage, there's some, terrible things happen. And one is dealt with by one court in one particular way and the other's dealt in another court another way. I mean, how's that ever going to be acceptable to anyone?
Yeah, it's simply not. It's simply not. And you can absolutely take in, consideration someone's upbringing, but you'd probably find that it doesn't matter. It's not a racial thing. It's about, socioeconomic circumstances as to why, the number one reason why anybody gets on the path to of exposure to domestic and family violence or being victims themselves, sexual abuse, and lack of schooling. They're the main key reasons for any human around the globe. It just so happens to be that for Indigenous kids, they experience it at far greater rates. But you can't then go in the judicial system, well, hang on a second, because of this person's racial heritage, we have to treat them differently. That's, again, we can't have two different standards and a lowered standard for Indigenous people.
Well, that's the point. If the Indigenous 15-year-old and the non-Indigenous 15-year-old grew up in exactly the same circumstances, disadvantage, abuse, lack of schooling, you're going to have under the Uruk Commission the Indigenous child going in one direction and the non-Indigenous child going in another direction. That doesn't seem fair.
No, and it doesn't work, and it actually doesn't fix circumstances for anybody. It doesn't get to the root cause as to why those kids find themselves in those situations. It's not helpful at all. Okay, always good to talk to you, and thanks for your time again today. Thanks, Ray. Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price talking to us, the Federal Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs.